Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hello and welcome to the ISO Show. Well, on the last episode, we were joined by Derek Hall, MBE, a senior consultant here at Blackmores, who shared with us his experience and knowledge and career to date on implementing ISO standards. Today, we're going to be talking about implementing ISO 14001, the environmental standard. Now, this standard is and always has been the most popular environmental standard for businesses at a global level. At Blackmores, we've had a wealth of experience of implementing this over the last few years or so, and I thought it would be a great opportunity for Derek, who's our most experienced consultant here, to share with you some hints and tips on how to implement the standard. So we won't be able to squeeze it all into one podcast. We'll be doing that over 3 podcasts. So let's start. Hi Derek, welcome back.
Hello Mel.
Great, thanks for joining us again. Before we delve into the first stage of a project, could you just give us your view on what you think are the greatest benefits and value from a business having an environmental management system in place?
Well, I think most businesses are looking at the bottom line. So I think it's really important that you can relate environmental improvement to that. So enviro-economics, I'd call it. It needs to actually mean something. Even though nowadays most companies, most people are far more socially aware of the impacts of the environment. But yes, it's about hitting the sort of nerve points within an organisation. It could be plastic, for instance. Somebody might have watched the David Attenborough thing recently on pollution into the oceans and so on. Might have a passion to try and relate that to what their company does. On the other hand, they might not, but then that's where greater knowledge comes in. Absolutely,
yeah. Because I think in our experience, you mentioned about doing the right thing socially. I think a lot of organisations implement ISO 14001 because they've got a key client that's requesting it, so it's being pushed down the supply chain. But going back to what you said earlier about having that knowledge, it's only really when you start to practice environmental management that you realise that, yes, it can have an impact on the bottom line.
Yeah, that's correct. And that's what I found in my previous life in the printing industry. You could relate the 2 subjects or 3 subjects, the social, the economic, the environmental. And then it really meant something.
And you work with a wide range of companies, don't you, both in terms of industry and size of organisation?
True.
Could you just explain what types of businesses you work with on environmental standards, Derek?
Well, I've worked with, ironically, printing companies, but I also work with construction companies, electrical suppliers, wiring contractors, and wide range of different organisations, both public and private sector.
Okay, so it is really a standard for all businesses, isn't it?
Correct,
Yeah. So where do we begin then, Derek? So you're given a brief, this client needs to implement ISO 14001. Where does it all begin?
Well, invariably it'll begin with some sort of interview process to look at what the company wants, what their real needs are, what their aims are. And then leading into what we call a gap analysis, systematically looking at how well they perform against each of the clauses of the standard. Now that usually takes around a day to produce. And what you want to do there on a gap analysis is interview the main interested parties, the main stakeholders, let's say. So that can be managers, directors, employees. It could even involve contractors that work for the organisation.
So any individual that would be involved with the process that has an environmental impact then?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, great. And what's the next stage after that then?
Well, after you've developed a gap analysis, then a bit of breathing space because the client needs to really divulge the findings and also make plans on how they can fill the potential gaps. So a bit of breathing space, and it varies from client to client. But then once the client is ready, we can then go in to the client and start developing a management system.
Okay, and so obviously there are a number of requirements within ISO 14001. What's the next stage then really? Where do you begin as far as creating that environmental management system?
I'd probably start with areas like the policy, an environmental policy. What's the aim of the company? Certainly be looking at having some sort of structured manual, environmental manual, or maybe a combined manual, because many companies have got quality systems, so you need to probably see what best practice they do on the quality front as well. So once you've got some sort of structural spine to the process, you then can start working on what I call the 3 key areas on the environmental system. One will be looking at the significant environmental aspects of the organisation and the associated impact. The other one will be looking at the legal compliance against those aspects and looking at what legal compliance the company has or needs to have and relate it to the significant environmental aspects. And then once you've got those 2 parts organised, let's say, or in process, you then can start evolving objectives. So the objectives then can be written around the significant aspects. So in many organisations they will develop a whole list of objectives, but they might not directly relate to what's significant in the organisation.
Good point, and I think that's one question that we get asked quite a lot, isn't it? So has it got to cover absolutely everything? And well, yes, in some respects, but there'll be some areas within the organisation that are costing the business more money, like energy. So if you're a data centre, for example,
right,
energy is your biggest overhead cost. You've got minimal staff, but energy is your biggest cost in terms of running the organisation. So just to reiterate then, those 3 points: aspects and impacts, legal and other requirements, regulatory requirements, and objectives. Let's delve into the first one then in a little bit more detail then, Derek. What is an aspects and impacts register, for example?
Well, with aspects, you're looking at, you've already touched on it, energy would be, in most companies, a key aspect. Waste is quite often a key aspect, certainly in manufacturing. There could be lots of different types of aspects you might not have thought about that only pertain to what the organisation does. But certainly you're looking at things like energy, you're looking at waste, you're looking at maybe effluent, you're looking at land contamination. There's a whole array of aspects. But I think it goes back to the beginning. You need to understand what the organisation does. So if, for instance, they're a construction company, what are they doing? They're probably laying foundations, digging up the earth. There's waste from that process. So that's significant to them. And if you're a printing company, you're relying on the, say, paper and ink suppliers supplying you materials. So somewhere in that process, you've got key aspects.
So what does that inform a business then?
Well, certainly it informs the business. It's certainly in terms of procurement. Procurement is a sadly overlooked environmental aspect because you're procuring something that you need to carry out an activity.
So the aspects and impacts register could potentially identify the costs of certain environmental things like energy. What's the cost of energy? What's the cost of water? What's the cost of waste to the business? Which of those is the most significant? Which I guess then leads you into the legal aspects then, does that?
Well, it leads you into the legal aspects, but I'll throw in another aspect actually, and that's design. Design and development, often thought as only a qualitative thing, is actually within ISO 14001.
Interesting, yeah.
So you're looking at maybe design of packaging. Can you reduce the level or the amount of packaging used?
Absolutely, which could have obviously reduction on environmental impact, but also make the organisation leaner, so saving money, and giving that organisation a competitive advantage potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I can give real examples of certainly 2 of my companies actually reducing the level of packaging they use by better design.
I think that's another podcast, isn't it, Derek? I'm getting excited about this one. I think we need to cover aspects and impacts in a separate podcast, definitely.
Right.
So let's move on, because I know that's a really interesting area and we could talk about that all day.
True, yeah.
I definitely could. But let's look at the legal aspect, because I think this is where a lot of organisations don't actually realise what the legislative and regulatory requirements are for their business in their industry.
Yeah.
So how do you go about approaching this, Derek?
Well, first of all, I think the terminology's started to change and has changed in the latest standards. We're talking about compliance obligations. Previously, it used to be legal and other requirements. So even though that's still there, legal, most companies I speak with have got some understanding of their legal compliance. What gets sort of missed really would be some of the softer issues, other requirements or compliance obligations. So other requirements, spoken about design a moment ago, Design and Patents Act. Now you could say, what's that to do with the environment? So as I already said, it has an interconnect. And there are lots of codes of practices that companies deal with that don't actually end up in their legal register. But the normal things, let's say, the waste hierarchy, the waste regulations, the WE directive, the Waste Electronic Equipment Directive, hazardous waste directives, they all get added into the company's legal register. The difficulty, I suppose, for us consultants, as well as the organisation, is understanding the relative requirements related to their process. So if it's waste electronic equipment, well, what waste electronic, what part does that impact on the organisation? So you could have, we can have a whole debate on legal requirements and we can get into some depth, but that's a key thing, is relating the piece of legislation to what the organisation actually does.
Okay, great. And then the third thing that you mentioned was objectives. So could you give us an example of an environmental objective for a small business, for example, that you've come across as a result of reviewing their environmental aspects and impacts and legal requirements?
Yeah, well, again, this is where aspects are absolutely key, because you need to understand what the organisation does. For instance, in the construction industry, I said earlier, they dig into the ground, basically. So you've got a thing called muck away, which is earth removal. So that's an environmental aspect. So you then evolve or develop objectives based on that activity. How well can you control it? What lorries are you using to remove that earth? What's the tonnage on those lorries? What's the waiting time? What's the CO2 on those lorries? So you can develop then objectives based on that activity. So less waiting time, for instance, which is less cost, which is less environmental impact. So again, it's key, absolutely key, that the objectives relate to the significant aspects. And there are many small companies, anything to do with waste removal, how can you reduce the impact of that? Because again, it's a cost. Energy, you spoke about earlier on, energy. Virtually every company uses some form of energy. So how can you reduce energy costs, etc.
Excellent. Okay, great. So with the objectives then, that's giving a very clear action target for the company to work towards that may not have been necessarily that clear in the past.
Yeah.
And I guess that then helps to then identify where the controls need to be put in place and procedures, which we can then discuss in the next podcast. So thanks very much for that then, Derek. So it's great that we've covered off benefits and values of an environmental management system, conducting the gap analysis, understanding the requirements of the business, understanding the significant environmental aspects and impacts of an organisation, understanding the compliance requirements, including legal and other requirements, and then finally, to cap it all, having some very clear and concise objectives that that business can put in place to help to reduce its environmental impact.
Correct, yeah.
But of course, you need an environmental system in order to help to make that happen on a systematic basis. So at that point, I think it's a wrap, and we'll discuss that in more detail on the next episode of the ISO show. So thanks very much for joining us today, Derek.
Thank you, Mel.
And we look forward to joining you again on the next ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at Blackmores